a land of rugged beauty and unending hardship. In the quiet spaces between the mountains and the sea, there once lay a Scotland that most would scarcely recognize. It was not the romantic land of tartan pageantry or gentle locks reflecting the sun. Instead, it was a place where the land itself seemed intent on testing the spirit of those who called it home. When dawn crept across the highlands, its pale light revealed a terrain that was both magnificent and merciless. Jagged ridges broke through blankets of fog, their stone flanks roughened by centuries of bitter winds. The valleys beneath, where low stone cottages huddled in small clusters, were often choked with cold mists that never fully lifted, as if the earth itself preferred to keep its secrets hidden. The Scottish climate had no soft edges. Winter arrived early and lingered longer than any welcome, the snow and sleet blending into weeks of gray rain. Summers brought only a fleeting warmth, just enough to coax barley and oats to life in the shallow soils before the next storm came to flatten them again. For the medieval Scots, every day began with the question of whether nature would grant a small reprieve or deliver another blow. In those centuries, the land was more than a backdrop. It was a constant participant in the struggle. When the fields failed, hunger stalked every doorway. When the rains came, roads dissolved into sucking bogs that swallowed hooves and wagons. Along the coast, sudden gales would seize fishermen's boats, carrying them away without warning or ceremony. The sea itself, though bountiful, demanded lives as payment for each catch. A man might rise before dawn, set out in the dark to check his nets, and never be seen again except as a story whispered by his kin. Meanwhile, the interior glens held their own silent challenges. Thick forests of pine and oak pressed close, their shadows cooling the air even in midsummer. Wolves still roamed there, lean and restless, their howls threading through the trees at night. Some believed that spirits also walked in those woods, guardians or tricksters, depending on whom you asked. It was a land where superstition and survival wove together in quiet understanding. Settlements rarely grew beyond small clusters of homes and a kirk of cold stone. Inside, the walls were blackened with soot from the peat fires that smoked through the long nights. Families gathered around the hearth, sharing thin stews and listening for the muffled sounds of rain tapping at the thatch. Here, the simplest pleasures, warmth, a dry roof, a shared meal, became treasures to hold close. Peasants and crofters knew this world intimately. They knew how to read the color of the sky at dawn, how to watch for the shifting winds, and how to store enough grain to outlast the hunger months. The land offered few gifts freely. Even the smallest harvest demanded months of unending labor, hands split and raw from the plow and the scythe. And all the while, the great mountains stood watch over the fields, solemn and unmoved by the toils of humankind. Despite its hardness, there was an unspoken reverence for this landscape. Perhaps it was the knowledge that without these hills and glens, there would be no Scotland at all. The same slopes that blunted the charge of English armies also concealed small communities of kin, sheltering them from enemies and storms alike. The same relentless rains that rotted grain also made the highland grass rich enough to nourish hardy cattle. This was a land that never yielded without a price, yet never left its people entirely abandoned. In this era, survival was a communal act. Neighbors bound themselves together, offering what help they could. If one family lost their herd to disease or theft, others would share milk or grain, knowing that tomorrow it could be their turn to stand in need. Children grew up watching their parents bargain with the land, coaxing a living from the stubborn soil, repairing stone walls toppled by the wind, and always, always storing away against the lean time Zamin to come. Through it all, faith and folklore intertwined. In each village, it was common to hear a grandmother's voice, soft with memory, recounting tales of saints who once walked these hills, or of ancient gods who had never fully left. These stories were passed down not as entertainment, but as a form of quiet guidance, a reminder that endurance had always been the first virtue of the Scottish spirit. As the centuries passed, the people and the land shaped each other in ways neither could fully escape. Even those who eventually left for the lowlands, or farther still, carried with them the imprint of this place, a knowledge that hardship could be borne with patience, and that beauty often arrived clothed in harshness. If you listen closely to the winds that curl through the glens, you may still hear a faint echo of the old life. Voices carried on the air, murmuring of the days when every dawn was a negotiation with the land itself. And perhaps you might wonder what secret strengths were forged in those quiet, relentless battles between humankind and the elements. The clan system, loyalty, honor, and endless feuds. Among the steep ridges and the green, narrow valleys, there rose an order older than any king's decree. It was the order of the clans, those sprawling families bound by blood, loyalty, and a name that carried both protection and peril. A clan was more than a group of relatives. It was the closest thing to certainty in a world where the harvest might fail, invaders might arrive, or a neighbor might suddenly become an enemy. To belong to a clan was to know where you stood, even if where you stood was often on the edge of violence. At the center of each clan was the chief, a figure who combined the roles of father, warlord, and judge. He was the one who decided when to raise the targa and claymore in anger, and when to let an old grievance lie sleeping for another season. To his clansmen, he offered a form of justice that was rough but consistent. If a kinsman fell in battle or suffered a theft, it was the chief's duty to make it right, sometimes through compensation, and more often through reprisal. Loyalty to one's chief and kin was not optional. It was the air one breathed, learned in childhood, and never questioned. From the moment a boy could carry a small dirk, he was taught the stories of his people, who had wronged them, who had defended them, and whose blood still cried out for retribution. These memories were not written in books but repeated around the fire, spoken in the low, measured voices of old men whose hands still bore the scars of past raids. The Highlands especially were a patchwork of rival clans, their boundaries often no more than an invisible line across a hillside. On one side, cattle grazed under the watch of Campbell's sentries. On the other, MacDonalds sharpened their weapons and waited for night to fall. A single insult, a stolen herd, or a disputed marriage could ignite a feud that smoldered for generations. To us, the violence seems senseless, but to them, it was simply the price of defending honor, a word that meant everything and cost so much. When raids came, they came without warning. On a dark winter morning, the clang of a horn could tear through a village, sending women and children fleeing to the safety of the nearest peel tower, those squat fortresses with their narrow windows and thick stone walls. Men would grasp their weapons with steady hands, ready to fight not for a king or a nation, but for their own name. The cattle they drove off were more than property. They were the measure of a clan's strength, the means to feed and ransom and settle old scores. And yet, even in this constant readiness for conflict, there was a fragile balance. Chiefs often arranged marriages to knit alliances together. A daughter might be promised to a rival's son, her wedding feast, a temporary pause in the cycle of feud and retaliation. For a little while, the fires burned in celebration instead of destruction. But such truces rarely lasted. The memory of an insult lingered longer than any treaty, waiting for a new generation to renew the quarrel. In the lowlands, the clans held less sway, but kinship still mattered. Here, land was more valuable than in the rocky north, and disputes often unfolded in courts rather than on hillsides. Yet even in these more settled places, the idea of belonging to a name, of having an unbreakable tie to those who shared your blood, remained a quiet force. To outsiders, the clans might have seemed primitive or chaotic, a relic of an earlier time. But within their bonds lay a fierce comfort. A man who had nothing else still had his clan. If a roof fell in, cousins came to help rebuild it. If hunger struck, food was shared without question. If death arrived, it did not come to an isolated soul, but to one member of a wider circle of grief. The laws of the land tried again and again to curb the power of the chiefs, to replace their authority with that of the crown. Royal proclamations declared that raids would be punished, that feuds must end, that all men owed allegiance first to the king. But the glens were far from Edinburgh, and in the hidden valleys, the word of the chief still weighed more than any distant monarch's seal. Meanwhile, the church also tried to soften the edges of clan life. Priests preached forgiveness, urged reconciliation, and reminded their flocks that vengeance was a sin. Yet even they knew how deep the old loyalties ran. A priest might bless the weapons of men who planned to raid a rival's lands before dawn, praying for their safety even as he prayed for peace. In quiet times, when no feud demanded attention and no enemy threatened the borders, the clan became a more tender thing. Families gathered to tell stories, to pass down songs that traced the lineage of their people back to mythical ancestors. Bards composed verses that praised the courage of a chief or the virtue of a matron who kept her household strong through lean years. Even the children sensed that to belong was to inherit not only old quarrels, but also a heritage of resilience. As the centuries unfolded, the power of the clans would rise and fall with the tides of history. English kings would try to break them, Scottish kings would try to tame them, and in time, new laws and new faiths would erode their authority. But in those early centuries, when the Highlands were still wild and the Lowlands still wary, the clan was the heart of Scotland, a stubborn, unyielding heart that beat in time with the land itself. And somewhere between the crests of these old hills, you might wonder how many secret oaths and quiet acts of defiance still echo among the stones. The peasants' struggle, back-breaking labor and scarcity. Beneath the tall towers of clan chiefs and the cold sanctuaries of the church, there moved the quiet majority whose names seldom entered any chronicle. These were the peasants, the crofters, the tenants who held their small strips of land by ancient custom or the will of their overlord. They were the ones who rose before the sun and laid their tired bodies down long after dusk, their lives measured in harvests and hunger. Their days began in the dark, when the cold pressed in through the chinks of stone walls, and the peat fire had dwindled to embers. The first task was always to coax a little warmth into the room, a handful of dried moss, a breath blown carefully into the coals, a slow stirring of flame that grew just enough to light the single space where family and animals alike shared the night's shelter. In these cramped homes, it was not unusual for cattle to sleep on one side of the partition, their warm breath a small defense against the freezing air. Outside, the ground was rarely dry. Even in summer, the low fields glistened with moisture, and the rough pastures clung to mist. A man might spend the morning bent over rows of oats or barley, his fingers red from the chill. Women worked beside him, their skirts darkened with dew, their backs stooped under the weight of baskets or the burden of endless repetition. The children joined in as soon as they could lift a tool, and from that moment on, their days would belong to the land. The soil itself was often poor, thin, stony, exhausted by generations of cultivation and neglect. Crops failed with weary regularity, and when they did, hunger arrived like a quiet intruder, sitting patiently at every threshold. Meals became smaller, then worse. In the hardest seasons, it was not unheard of for families to survive on a few handfuls of meal stirred into water, or the tough roots pulled from the edges of fields. Yet there was no choice but to keep working. The feudal dues still had to be paid. Barley for the laird's storehouse, sheep or cattle for the tithe, a portion of every harvest set aside to meet obligations that never shrank, no matter how lean the year. When payments were late, collectors came to the door, their presence a reminder that even misery was taxed. The church, too, demanded its share. The priest might be a kindly man, might speak softly of mercy in the next life, but he still expected the pennies owed for the upkeep of the kirk. The contradiction was not lost on the poor, this faith that promised salvation, yet never spared them the burden of its earthly costs. In some villages, there were shallow quarries, where men broke stones for building or hacked peat from the bogs to burn for heat. The work was slow, damp, and unending. Others labored in the woods, felling trees to make charcoal or hewing rough beams for distant fortresses. The reward was a small coin, a little flour, sometimes only permission to keep living on land that was never truly theirs. And yet, in all this hardship, life persisted. In the evenings, when the work was finally done, families gathered around the hearth. The youngest would drift to sleep on sheepskins spread near the fire. The elders might murmur prayers or recite the old stories, how the clan had once been mighty, how an ancestor had fought at Bannockburn, how someday, perhaps, better times would come. There were moments of celebration, too, however modest. The birth of a child, a marriage, a good harvest that deserved a small feast. At these times, the same hands that labored all year found the strength to lift a cup and dance to the wail of a fiddle. For a little while, laughter rose to the dark rafters, and the weight of survival lifted just enough to remember joy. Through the seasons, the rhythm never faltered. Planting, tending, reaping, storing. The cycle repeated itself as it had for centuries, anchored by the same prayers and the same fears. It was a life stripped to its simplest elements: food, shelter, kin. To outsiders, it might have looked like drudgery without hope. But for those who lived it, there was a certain quiet dignity and endurance. When disease crept through the valleys, fevers that stole infants in the night, pox that left scars and empty cradles, the community gathered to bury the dead and comfort the living. There was no luxury of distance. Loss belonged to everyone, and perhaps it was this shared grief that made the bonds between neighbors so unspokenly strong. At times, wandering friars would arrive, carrying news from the wider world. Wars fought far away, treaties signed and broken, kings crowned and toppled. To the peasants, these stories felt as remote as legends. The real struggle was always here, in the wet fields and the cold cottages, where each sunrise was both a promise and a demand. And so the centuries passed, marked by the slow transformation of hands into something as weathered as the land itself. The names of these humble laborers rarely survived in records, but if you walk the old paths and look closely at the stones of ruined cottages, you might feel the lingering trace of their spirit, a quiet insistence that life, however meager, was still worth claiming day by day. Perhaps you will find yourself wondering what strength it took to rise again each morning, knowing that the struggle would never truly end. the dominion of the Catholic Church. In the midst of hunger and strife, there stood an institution whose influence reached into every hearth and field, the medieval church. Its presence was as constant as the turning of the seasons, and just as unyielding. From the grand abbeys that rose like stone ships above the lowlands, to the small chapels tucked into the folds of the glens, the Catholic faith threaded itself into every corner of Scottish life. At dawn, the tolling of bells called even the most weary to prayer. In villages where peasants rose before the sun to trudge into the fields, the sound was both a comfort and a summons. It reminded them that beyond their own labors lay a higher order, a promise that the hardships of this life might be redeemed in the next. Whether they believed it fully or simply hoped it was true, they gathered beneath the cold arches of their kirk, pressing their worn bodies into narrow pews as the priest intoned familiar Latin phrases. The church offered many things: a measure of learning, a framework of law, an invisible bridge between this world and the one to come. But it also demanded a great deal. Tithes and dues were collected with unblinking regularity. Even in the hardest winters, when families survived on thin broth and dried roots, a portion of every yield was owed to God's house. For some, this sacrifice was a willing offering. For others, it was a burden that never lightened. Clergy varied from humble, soft-spoken pastors to powerful abbots who controlled broad estates and countless tenants. In the grand monasteries of Melrose, Jedburgh, and Dunfermline, monks labored over illuminated manuscripts or tended physic gardens filled with herbs. These places felt almost like separate worlds, islands of relative order amid a sea of uncertainty. To wander their cloisters was to glimpse a life that most would never know, a life of study, contemplation, and quiet seclusion. Yet not all was pious or pure. In time, the wealth and authority of the church grew so vast that corruption followed like a shadow. Bishops dined in splendor while peasants starved. High-born clerics negotiated alliances with nobles and kings, their ambitions as worldly as any laird's. The promise of salvation was too often entangled with the threat of excommunication, the unspoken bargain that faith required not only belief, but submission. For the ordinary Scot, religion was woven into the smallest details of daily life. A marriage could not be solemnized without a priest's blessing. A newborn child was swiftly baptized, lest its soul wander unshriven if it died. Festivals marked the calendar, holy days that offered both respite and obligation. Even the tools of survival carried religious meaning. A scythe might be blessed before harvest, a herd sprinkled with holy water to ward off disease. When illness struck, many turned to the church for help. The monasteries were among the few places where a sick peasant might find a bed, a bowl of broth, and a tincture of herbs. Monks and nuns offered such care without question, their vows of charity compelling them to ease suffering wherever they found it. In this way, the church's harshness and its kindness existed side by side, as inseparable as the dark and the dawn. Fear was never far from faith. Tales of hellfire and damnation circulated in every settlement. Children grew up hearing of sinners cast into eternal torment, of witches consorting with devils, of divine retribution that could fall at any moment. These stories shaped imaginations as much as any scripture, reminding all who listened that no corner of life was beyond God's gaze. In the Highlands, old beliefs mingled stubbornly with Christian teaching. Superstitions clung to the edges of the faith, rituals to keep away the fair folk, charms to guard against curses. Some priests tolerated these remnants, seeing them as harmless comforts. Others waged quiet campaigns to uproot them, convinced that every scrap of the old ways was a threat to the soul's salvation. Meanwhile, across Scotland, the slow churn of reform began to stir. Dissenters questioned the need for lavish churches when so many went hungry. Preachers whispered that faith should be simple, that no earthly institution should claim the power to decide who was worthy of grace. These early murmurs would grow louder in the centuries to come, but in the medieval period, they were still small voices carried on the wind. Despite all its contradictions, the church remained a central pillar of life. When the bells tolled for a funeral, the whole community gathered to walk behind the coffin, their steps measured and solemn. In those moments, whatever grudges divided them fell away. All were equal before the grave and before the God they trusted, sometimes in fear, sometimes in hope, to grant them peace. It was in the dim, candlelit spaces of the kirk that the people of Scotland came face to face with the mystery of existence. No matter how harsh their days, they paused to kneel, to cross themselves, to whisper prayers they barely understood, but could not do without. In the hush that followed, they might have wondered whether the same God who watched over the mighty lairds also heard the pleas of the lowliest crofter. Perhaps you will find yourself imagining the stillness of those moments, the flicker of faith that glowed even in the darkest corners of a cold stone chapel. The Black Death, a visitor nobody wanted. In the year 1350, a new terror crept across Scotland's rugged borders. It did not arrive in the form of armies marching under foreign banners or rival clans brandishing steel. It came silently, hidden in the fur of rats and the bite of unseen fleas. The Black Death made no distinction between laird and peasant, priest and outlaw. It settled on the land like an invisible frost, consuming life wherever it touched. The first rumors drifted north with traders. In Flanders and England, they said, entire towns had emptied. Ships sailed into harbors, manned only by corpses. Some called it God's punishment, others a poison released by unseen enemies. But to most, it was simply a dread whose shape no one fully grasped until it was too late. In the ports of the lowlands, the plague's arrival was swift and merciless. Ships docked, unloading barrels of grain and bales of cloth, unaware that they carried the seeds of catastrophe. Dock workers fell ill within days, their skin marked by dark swellings that spread with a dreadful certainty. Those who cared for the sick were soon infected themselves, and the disease moved inland with the urgency of a wildfire driven by wind. Villages that had endured famine and war found themselves defenseless against an enemy they could neither see nor eat. The symptoms appeared quickly: a fever that burned like an inner flame, swellings under the arms and in the groin, the dark mottling of skin as life slipped away. Within days, a strong man could be reduced to a hollow form, breathing raggedly until silence claimed him. Those who could fled into the hills, believing the open air would spare them. Some closed their doors and waited in dread, rationing stores of oats and salt meat as neighbors perished on all sides. The fields stood untended, cattle wandered the lanes without herders, and the quiet of the countryside became the hush of loss. In cities and towns, the church bells tolled endlessly, marking each new passing. Priests, exhausted and trembling, recited last rites again and again, their own faces gaunt with fear. Monks carried the dead to hurried graves, digging trenches so wide that entire families could be laid side by side. No ceremony could ease the finality of it. No prayer could slow the relentless count. Yet even in this desolation, the rhythms of faith continued. In small chapels, a few worshippers gathered, their voices thin but resolute. They lit candles in memory of the departed and asked for mercy for the living. Some believed the plague was a test, a refining fire meant to reveal the pure of heart. Others despaired. convinced that all their piety had earned them nothing but ruin. The plague did not spare the strongholds of the highlands. Though the remote glens delayed its coming, it found a path along the cattle drovers' trails and the narrow passes between mountains. In time, even the clans, so fierce in war, so proud of their lineage, could only watch as kin and rival alike succumbed to the same cruel fate. In some places, desperation gave rise to superstition. Bands of flagellants wandered the roads, scourging themselves in penance, believing that pain might atone for the sins of all. Others whispered that witches had summoned the plague, that dark powers were at work beyond any mortal understanding. Fear ripened into suspicion, and suspicion into violence. But for most, survival was a quieter ordeal. Families huddled together, sharing what little food remained, counting the days since the last cough or fever. If no new illness came, they dared to hope they might be spared. If it did, there was little left to do but wait and pray. When at last the first wave began to recede, it left behind a landscape altered in ways no war had managed. In some villages, scarcely a third of the people survived. Fields lay fallow, their hedgerows overgrown. Entire lineages disappeared, their names vanishing from parish records. Those who remained stepped cautiously back into the world. They buried the last of the dead, reclaimed the wandering cattle, patched the thatch on their roofs. In time, the plow returned to the earth. Oats and barley grew again. Markets reopened, though fewer voices called out in the square. And though life resumed its familiar patterns, nothing felt quite the same. A quiet wariness lingered, an unspoken knowledge that no fortress of stone or bond of kin could fully shield them. The plague had revealed how fragile even the strongest communities could be. Yet in the slow months of recovery, there was also a hushed resilience. People learned to carry their grief like a hidden weight, to remember those who were gone without letting sorrow extinguish every ember of hope. They told the children stories of the ones they had lost, and in this way, the departed remained part of the living world. If you close your eyes and imagine the Scottish hills in those years, you might picture a land stripped bare, yet strangely luminous with endurance, a place where even the plague could not fully conquer the stubborn will to begin again. And you might wonder what quiet courage it took to open each door and step into a world forever changed. William Wallace and the dream of freedom, before the plague carried away so many lives, before the endless clan feuds consumed whole generations, there was another struggle that etched itself into the heart of Scotland, a struggle against foreign rule, and the quiet conviction that a people could shape their own destiny. At the center of this dream stood William Wallace, a man whose legend grew so large that centuries later, it still stirs a quiet reverence. Wallace was not born into great wealth or power. His family held modest lands in Renfrewshire, and in another life, he might have passed his days as a minor knight, tending cattle, settling small disputes, and living out an unremarkable fate. But the tides of history rarely leave room for such simplicity. By the late 13th century, Scotland had become the object of English ambition. Edward Worcester, tall, iron-willed, relentless, saw the northern kingdom as unfinished business, a land to be brought under his rule as surely as any other province. The first English incursions were methodical, almost impersonal. Castles were garrisoned, nobles were pressed to swear fealty, and those who hesitated found their land seized and their kin taken hostage. Resistance flickered here and there, brief rebellions that rose like sparks and died quickly under Edward's heavy hand. But the resentment smoldered on, gathering heat in hidden places. It was in this charged atmosphere that Wallace stepped forward, not as a king or a chieftain, but as a man unwilling to bow. The stories say that it was a personal insult, a murdered family member, a wrong too deep to forgive, that first set him on the path of defiance. Whether that tale is true or merely an echo of older ballads, it is certain that Wallace soon became a rallying figure for all who were weary of submission. His earliest actions were swift and startling. Small bands of men, lightly armed, struck at English outposts under the cover of darkness. Supply wagons were burned, garrisons routed, and messengers intercepted. Word of these raids spread quickly across the lowland lands, carried in the hushed admiration of common folk who had never before glimpsed a Scot bold enough to challenge England so openly. But Wallace's defiance was not merely an act of guerrilla mischief. By 1297, he had gathered an army, rough, poorly equipped, but bound by something deeper than any oath. They met the English at Stirling Bridge, where Wallace and his co-commander, Andrew de Moray, devised a strategy as simple as it was effective. They let the English forces begin their crossing, then struck with sudden force, dividing their enemy and driving them into the river. It was a victory so complete that for a moment, all of Scotland dared to believe independence was possible. Chronicles tell how the news spread across the land, carried by riders and pilgrims. In the cottages and kirks, people repeated Wallace's name in quiet wonder, as though the mere fact of his success had changed the nature of what could be hoped for. After Stirling, Wallace was appointed Guardian of Scotland, a title that came less with privilege than with a heavy expectation. He pressed the advantage, leading raids into Northumberland, striking back across the border to remind England that Scotland would not remain a passive province. But such defiance invited a reckoning. Edward returned in person, bringing with him a disciplined army and the weight of a king's fury. At Falkirk in 1298, the two forces clashed on open ground. This time, English archers and cavalry proved overwhelming. The Scottish lines broke under the assault, and Wallace's army dissolved into retreat. Though he escaped with his life, his authority was diminished. The nobles, ever wary of risking too much, began to hedge their support. Wallace slipped into the shadows, continuing his resistance without the sanction of a formal title. For years, he moved through the hidden places of Scotland, a fugitive whose presence still inspired small acts of rebellion wherever he passed. In 1305, betrayal found him at last. Captured and delivered to Edward's men, he was taken in chains to London. There, in the heart of the kingdom he had defied, he stood trial for treason, a charge he refused to accept. To Wallace, he owed no allegiance to England. His loyalty belonged only to the land that had shaped him. The sentence was carried out with a cruelty meant to extinguish all memory of his defiance. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his remains displayed as a warning to any who might think to follow. But the warning failed in its purpose. If anything, it only deepened the resolve of those who still dreamed of freedom. In the quiet years that followed, when Scotland's fortunes rose and fell like the tides, Wallace's story endured. Mothers told it to their children as they rocked them to sleep. Priests spoke of his sacrifice in sermons. Ballads carried his deeds across the glens and into distant generations. To some, he was a symbol of reckless rebellion. To others, the first true champion of Scottish independence. But to all, he remained a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there could be courage strong enough to light the way. And as you imagine the cold wind sweeping across the battlefield at Stirling, or the lonely cell in London where Wallace awaited his end, you might feel the quiet echo of that unwoken spirit, a whisper that no conqueror could ever fully silence. Robert the Bruce and the Battle of Bannockburn. When the story of Wallace began to fade into legend, a different figure stepped into the uncertain space he left behind. Robert the Bruce was no mere rebel leader, no outlaw making quick raids from the shadows. He was a nobleman of ancient lineage, a man who understood the language of kings and the harsh cost of ambition. His path was neither straightforward nor blameless, and perhaps that is why it feels so distinctly human. The Bruce had once sworn fealty to Edward of England, as so many Scottish lords did when survival demanded it. In that age, loyalty was a coin spent cautiously. But in time, Robert's ambitions outgrew any pledge to a foreign crown. He believed that Scotland should be ruled by her own, and that he was the rightful heir to the throne. His claim was not uncontested. Rival nobles gathered around John Comyn, another man with royal blood. The two met one winter day in the Greyfriars Church at Dumfries, ostensibly to find common ground. What happened in that sacred space remains partly hidden by time. Whether a quarrel erupted or an old grudge finally boiled over, Bruce struck Comyn down before the altar. It was a killing that echoed far beyond the church walls, a crime in the eyes of man and God alike. Yet even as excommunication loomed, Bruce moved swiftly. If he could not earn legitimacy by patience, he would seize it by resolve. Just weeks later, in the Abbey of Scone, he was crowned King of Scots. It was a fragile coronation, performed with borrowed regalia and the blessing of only some of the realm's lords. But for the first time in years, Scotland had a monarch determined to resist English dominion. Edward responded with the relentless efficiency that had subdued so many rebellions. English armies swept north, burning and confiscating. Bruce's early campaigns ended in defeat and retreat. At one point, he was little more than a fugitive, moving among the islands with a handful of loyal supporters. His family suffered greatly for his cause, his brothers executed, his wife imprisoned, his kingdom all but extinguished. Yet from this nadir, a slow resurgence began. Over years of hardship, Bruce learned to fight not as a feudal lord, but as a commander shaped by necessity. He struck quickly, avoiding open battle whenever possible, and reclaimed stronghold after stronghold. As English garrisons fell, more clans drifted back to his banner, sensing that his cause might yet prevail. By 1314, the pressure of his campaign forced Edward II, who had inherited the English crown, to act decisively. Edward assembled a massive host, perhaps the greatest force ever sent against Scotland. They advanced northward, confident that the weight of numbers and the discipline of their knights would crush Bruce's stubborn resistance. The two armies met near the village of Bannockburn, close to Stirling Castle, where an English garrison still held out. It was Midsummer's Eve. The Scottish host was smaller, perhaps only a fraction of the English strength, but Bruce had chosen his ground with care, a landscape of boggy hollows and narrow approaches where cavalry could not charge unchecked. On the eve of battle, legend says Bruce himself rode out to inspect the lines and encountered an English knight, Sir Henry de Bohun, who lowered his lance and spurred forward, eager to strike the Scottish king. In that moment, watched by friend and foe alike, Bruce turned aside the spear and with a single blow of his axe, struck de Bohun down. It was a gesture not of arrogance, but of assurance, a sign that he would not be cowed. When dawn came, the English forces advanced across the rough terrain, their banners bright against the rising sun. The Scottish schiltrons, dense formations of spearmen, stood shoulder to shoulder, bristling with pikes. As English cavalry tried to force a passage, the schiltrons held firm, absorbing the shock and driving the attackers back. Wave after wave fell upon them. The din of iron on iron rang across the fields, mingled with the cries of the wounded. Yet the Scottish lines refused to break. In time, the weight of the bog and the fierce counterstrikes began to tell. English ranks grew disordered. Panic spread along the rear. At last, when Bruce signaled the charge, his men surged forward, with a momentum born not of numbers, but of certainty. English soldiers fled in confusion, many drowning in the streams or falling beneath their own retreating horses. It was a rout so complete that it reshaped the balance of power overnight. For Scotland, Bannockburn was more than a battlefield triumph. It was a moment when the dream of self-determination became something more solid, a memory that could be held up in times of doubt, proof that the land itself could answer invasion with victory. In the years that followed, Bruce continued to consolidate his rule. Castles were retaken, alliances forged, the fabric of the kingdom mended one careful thread at a time. Though Edward II refused to acknowledge Scottish independence, the reality on the ground could not be denied forever. Yet for all the triumph, the cost remained heavy. So many had fallen: lords, farmers, men whose names were never recorded. And Bruce himself, though crowned and acclaimed, would spend his remaining years haunted by the knowledge of all he had sacrificed to reach that place. When you picture the fields of Bannockburn, thick with June grass and the echoes of struggle, you might feel the stillness that comes after great turmoil. And you may find yourself wondering how it feels to stand in that hush, knowing that, for a moment at least, the impossible had been achieved. The Highland-Lowland divide. As Scotland emerged from the struggles of kings and conquerors, another divide remained, quieter, older, and in some ways more enduring. It was the line, not always drawn on maps, that separated the Highlands from the Lowlands. A boundary of language, custom, and temperament. It shaped life in ways that no single battle could ever erase. In the north and west, the Highlands rose in silent defiance, mountains clothed in mist, glens cut by cold rivers, and long sea locks that reached deep into the land like patient fingers. Here, the Gaelic tongue lingered, spoken in lilting cadences passed down by generations of shepherds and fishermen. Clan chiefs still held sway, their authority rooted in blood ties and tradition as much as in any royal charter. Lowlanders often viewed these northern cousins with a wary fascination. They saw the Highlanders as fierce and ungovernable, prone to feuds, and given to old superstitions. The stories that traveled south spoke of cattle raids that began without warning, of midnight gatherings in hidden glens where ancient oaths were renewed by firelight. It was a culture at once romanticized and feared, admired for its tenacity and blamed for its resistance to change. Meanwhile, the lowlands grew more settled, their fields broader, and their villages clustered around parish kirks and market crosses. Scots, a Germanic tongue shaped by centuries of trade and contact with England, gradually replaced Gaelic here. Over time, the lowlands became the heart of royal administration and commerce, the place where new laws were drafted and alliances brokered. Yet despite these differences, the two worlds remained intertwined. Trade passed back and forth along winding drovers' roads. Every year, Highland herders drove thousands of black cattle to lowland fairs, places like Crieff and Falkirk, where the animals were sold to feed distant cities. The long journey south was more than a transaction. It was a ritual that reminded both regions of their shared dependence. The Highlands did not lack refinement or learning, as some lowlanders believed. In the halls of clan chiefs, Gaelic bards composed intricate poetry, recounting genealogies that stretched far into mythic time. Storytellers preserved the old tales of Fionn Macumhail, of the Tuatha De Danann, of warriors whose names echoed through the glens like remembered prayers. Music, too, bound the communities together. The keening sound of pipes, the plaintive voice of the harp. These were not just pastimes, but vessels of memory. Still, misunderstandings multiplied with the years. To lowlanders, the Highland way of life seemed archaic, its loyalty to chiefs a barrier to progress, its customs too foreign. And to Highlanders, the lowlands appeared soft, eager to trade kinship for coin, faith for convenience. Even religion deepened the rift. While the Reformation swept across the lowlands, replacing Catholic ritual with Presbyterian austerity, the Highlands often remained loyal to the old faith, clinging to the Latin Mass and the authority of Rome. In time, the Crown would make repeated efforts to bridge or erase the divide. Laws were passed requiring the sons of Highland chiefs to be educated in English-speaking schools. Statutes forbade the wearing of tartan and the carrying of weapons without permission. These measures were meant to bring uniformity, but instead left behind a quiet resentment. In some glens, the old ways endured in secret. Gaelic prayers were whispered long after they were outlawed. Tartan was hidden away, brought out only in the privacy of home. And always, there was the memory of independence, an unspoken conviction that no edict could fully reshape a people who had learned to survive in such a forbidding landscape. It was not only language and law that kept the Highlands apart. It was also the rhythm of life itself. Highlanders measured their days by the turning of the seasons, summer grazing in distant pastures, autumn gatherings to bring the cattle home. They marked time by the migrations of birds, the flowering of heather, the return of familiar stars in winter's sky. In the lowlands, the clock of commerce ticked more insistently. Towns bustled with weavers and merchants. Taxes were collected, markets regulated, disputes settled in court rather than by the sword. Over generations, the difference between the two ways of life became something deeper than custom, a divergence of spirit. Yet for all the contrasts, the Highlands and Lowlands could never be entirely separate. Marriage alliances wove threads between families on either side of the divide. Trade brought news and goods that no valley could wholly ignore. And when foreign powers threatened, Scots of every accent found themselves called to the same banners. If you imagine the lengthening shadows of a Highland glen, or the soft rain falling on a lowland field, you might sense that both belonged to the same story. A story of a small, resilient country that held together not in spite of its differences, but because of them. And perhaps you will wonder whether, in those days of suspicion and pride, anyone truly understood how much the Highlands needed the Lowlands, and how much the Lowlands needed the Highlands in return. The Campbells of the MacDonalds. Among all the rivalries that smoldered in the Highlands, none carried the same bitter weight as the feud between Clan Campbell and Clan MacDonald. For centuries, their enmity passed down like an inheritance, an old grievance wrapped around each generation, growing sharper with every fresh wound. The roots of the conflict reached back to the early 14th century, when Robert the Bruce, grateful for the Campbells' support in his wars of independence, rewarded them with lands long held by the MacDonalds. To the MacDonalds, this was not just a political maneuver. It was a theft of something sacred, an insult that time alone could not mend. And so the feud began, slow at first, then gathering its own momentum. In these glens and lochs, land was more than territory. It was the measure of a clan's identity, the soil from which its stories and honor sprang. To lose it was to become unmoored. Over the decades, the quarrel turned into a cycle of raids and reprisals. One year, MacDonald warriors swept into Campbell lands at dawn, driving off cattle and setting roofs alight. The next, Campbells returned the favor under cover of night, carrying off their enemies' wealth and leaving a trail of charred fields. These were not isolated events, but part of a long, grim ritual in which each raid justified the next. In quieter seasons, the feud would subside into wary silence. Chiefs on both sides would count their losses, bind up old wounds, and prepare for the inevitable resumption of hostilities. Peace was never trusted. It felt more like a pause between storms. The power of each clan extended far beyond its own hills. Both families cultivated ties with the crown, eager to secure royal favor as leverage against the other. The Campbells, in particular, grew close to the Scottish kings. Their reputation as loyal administrators earned them titles and influence. The MacDonalds, meanwhile, traced their authority back to the Lords of the Isles, a lineage that commanded respect across the western seaboard. As the centuries wore on, the rivalry found new fuel. When religion began to split Scotland, the Campbells embraced Protestant reforms, aligning themselves with Edinburgh's shifting politics. The MacDonalds, more isolated in their strongholds, remained Catholic, their faith woven into the old traditions. Even belief became a battleground. The feud reached one of its darkest moments in 1646. At Dunaverty Castle, hundreds of MacDonalds sought shelter from pursuing Campbells. The fortress, perched high on a promontory above the sea, had withstood many sieges. But this time, no relief came. As supplies dwindled, the MacDonalds agreed to surrender, trusting they would be treated as prisoners. Instead, the Campbells slaughtered them, men, women, and children alike. Bodies were cast from the cliffs into the waves. The massacre at Dunaverty, like the better-known tragedy of Glencoe that followed decades later, etched itself into clan memory as a wound that could not be forgiven. To outsiders, these cycles of vengeance seemed senseless, a bloodletting that wasted lives for pride and old grudges. But within the clans, the code of honor left little room for forbearance. To ignore a slight was to invite weakness. To forget a massacre was to betray the dead. Yet even amid the bitterness, the clans' lives were not only defined by conflict. Each had its own traditions of hospitality and generosity, its own bardic songs praising courage and lamenting loss. The same hands that wielded swords could also shape the intricate silverwork of a clan brooch, or weave the rich colors of a tartan. It was a culture that held violence and artistry in uneasy balance. And there were times, brief, almost accidental, when the old enemies found themselves allied. When foreign invaders threatened, or when the crown's ambitions grew too heavy-handed, Campbells and MacDonalds stood shoulder to shoulder out of necessity. These alliances were often as fragile as cobwebs, but for a moment they revealed a deeper truth, that both clans were, in the end, bound by the same land. Through it all, the feud persisted, reshaping the fortunes of generations. Children were taught the old stories and the names of those who had fallen. A MacDonald child learned to distrust a Campbell smile, just as surely as a Campbell child was warned to watch a MacDonald's hands. In time, government reforms and the slow erosion of clan power would quiet the conflict. But the memory remained, woven into the hills and the songs. Even in the 18th century, long after swords had been sheathed, poets still recited laments for the dead of Dunaverty and Glencoe. When you picture those wind-swept cliffs and the dark waves churning far below, you might sense how easily memory becomes a burden, and how, in the Highlands, a feud could last longer than any one lifetime. And you may find yourself wondering whether, in the end, the land itself remembers every footstep and every grief, holding the echoes of old enmities like a hidden heartbeat beneath the heather, the Catholic Church's shadow and solace. While the clans quarreled and kings made their claims, another power remained steady in its influence, a force older than the royal line of Bruce or the proud names of the Highland chiefs. The Catholic Church stood at the center of Scottish life, its presence felt in every milestone of existence, from birth to burial. It was both a shelter and a burden, a quiet consolation and a constant demand. In the small stone kirks of the lowlands and the hidden chapels of the glens, the faithful gathered to hear words spoken in Latin they did not fully understand. The priest's voice rose and fell in familiar patterns, and though the rituals were solemn, they offered a kind of reassurance. For peasants whose lives were shaped by hunger and disease, the Mass was an hour when all souls stood equal before the altar. But the church was more than a source of spiritual comfort. It was also a vast earthly institution, with wealth rivaling that of any noble family. Great abbeys like Melrose and Dunfermline commanded wide estates, their monks overseeing farmland, mills, and fisheries. In these enclaves, laborers worked the land, knowing that a share of every harvest would support the clergy, and that questioning this arrangement invited peril. Tithes pressed heavily on the poor. Even in years when crops failed and children went hungry, the expectation did not lessen. A portion of grain, a few coins, or the best fleece of a flock was owed, as though the church's hunger were a force as unrelenting as winter. Some accepted this as the price of salvation. Others, in quiet moments, nursed a resentment they dared not voice. Yet the church could also be the only refuge. When plague swept through the villages, monks tended to the sick, laying cool cloths on fevered brows and murmuring prayers for deliverance. In famine, the granaries of the abbeys sometimes opened, distributing bread to those too weak to stand. For a child born to poverty, the cloistered life of a monastery could offer a rare escape, a place where learning and piety replaced the ceaseless struggle of the fields. The tension between the church's charity and its power was never fully resolved. Bishops wore robes sewn with gold thread, feasted on meats the poor seldom tasted, and dispensed judgments that carried the weight of God's will. In remote parishes, priests were often the only authority, their word shaping how neighbors treated one another, how sins were measured, how forgiveness might be earned. Superstition walked hand in hand with faith. Even as priests condemned the old pagan customs, many villagers still clung to them. In the Highlands, a sprig of rowan might be nailed above a door to ward off witches. Charms and blessings mingled with Christian rites. A mother might whisper a Gaelic incantation over her child's cradle before crossing herself and reciting a Latin prayer. In times of crisis, fear of heresy and witchcraft grew sharp. Accusations could spring from envy, from old grudges, or from the need to find a cause for suffering. Women, especially those who served as healers or midwives, were most often accused. They were called before the kirk session, their faces pale in the torchlight as charges were read aloud. Few dared to defend them. To question an accusation was to risk suspicion oneself. For all the darkness, the church also held a softer role, a keeper of memory and hope. In candlelit chapels, monks labored over illuminated manuscripts, copying the Gospels letter by letter, their quills scratching in the hush. These pages, adorned with bright inks and curling vines of decoration, were seen by only a few. But they preserved the belief that faith outlasts the rise and fall of kingdoms. Among the saints venerated in Scotland, none loomed larger than St. Margaret, the English princess who became queen and devoted her life to piety and charity. Her example was held up to the people as proof that holiness could flourish even in a world so often ruled by ambition. The poor invoked her name when crops failed, trusting that her spirit still watched over them from beyond the grave. And so, century by century, the church's influence sank deeper into the soil of Scotland. Each generation inherited not only the rituals, but also the quiet understanding that this institution, for all its faults, was part of the landscape itself. No feast day passed without the toll of bells. No death was marked without the priest's blessing. If you close your eyes and imagine a winter night, wind sweeping across heather, smoke rising from a thatched roof, you might picture a small chapel glowing with lamplight. Inside, A handful of villagers kneel in the cold, their breaths clouding the air as they murmur prayers that have not changed in 100 years. And you might wonder what comfort they drew from those words, what small embers of faith warmed them against the long dark, and whether any truly believed the church could stand unchanged forever. Life and labor of the common Scots, beneath the spires of abbeys and the towers of clan chiefs, lay the true foundation of Scotland, a countless host of ordinary people whose names were seldom recorded, whose stories were passed only in memory. They were the crofters and laborers, the shepherds and weavers, who rose before dawn and worked until their limbs trembled with fatigue. Their lives were quiet and narrow, yet filled with a kind of tenacity that history rarely pauses to honor. From the lowlands to the far northern glens, most Scots knew the rhythm of toil by heart. The year began with plowing, teams of oxen dragging wooden blades through cold, reluctant earth. Each furrow was a promise, though not all promises were kept. Rain could fall without ceasing, rotting seedlings before they sprouted. A sudden frost could blacken an entire field overnight. When that happened, the only defense was to try again the next season. In the highlands, where soil was thin and fields were scattered, families worked small crofts cut into the slopes. They planted barley and oats, tended scraggly herds of sheep and cattle, and gleaned what they could from the rough pastures. Peat was cut and stacked in summer, drying under the weak sun so it might warm hearths during long, punishing winters. Children joined this labor almost as soon as they could walk. A boy might be set to watch a few goats on a hillside, learning to scan the horizon for wolves or raiders. A girl might carry buckets of water or help weave homespun cloth. Each year brought new chores, new burdens. By the time a child reached 15, he or she had shoulders strong enough to bear a grown person's share of hardship. Meals were plain, bannocks of oat and barley, boiled greens, a little cheese, sometimes a scrap of salted fish. On feast days, a wedding, a christening, the end of harvest, families might share mutton or beef, the rare taste of abundance reminding them what it meant to be truly sated. For most, hunger was not a catastrophe, but a companion that drifted in and out of daily life. In the lowlands, villages clustered around market squares and parish kirks. Here, labor diversified. There were millers who ground grain to flour, smiths whose hammers rang from dawn to dusk, coopers shaping barrels, weavers at their looms. Yet even these trades did not bring security. If harvests failed, or a lord demanded higher rents, all crafts suffered together. Taxes and tithes weighed heavily. Every harvest was divided before a family could claim its share, part for the laird, part for the church, part held back in case of famine. When all debts were met, what remained often fit into a few sacks, to be stretched across the lean months ahead. Still, the Scots found ways to ease their burdens. On winter evenings, neighbors gathered in low-roofed cottages, their faces lit by the glow of peat fires. There, songs were sung in Gaelic or Scots, ballads of lost battles and enduring love. Stories passed from one voice to the next, some true, some embroidered beyond recognition. In these moments, the harshness of daily life softened, if only for a while. Though the church warned against superstition, old beliefs clung stubbornly to the margins of faith. Charms to protect newborns, rituals to bless the planting, whispered prayers against the evil eye. These customs lived on because they were older than any priest's decree. They offered a sense of agency in a world that otherwise seemed ruled by chance and the will of distant masters. Marriage was often more practical than romantic. A union meant more hands to work the land, more alliances to guard against misfortune. A woman's wedding day was sometimes the only time she would wear shoes. Soft leather, stitched by a local craftsman. Her dowry might be a cow, chest of linens, or a promise of labor from her kin. When children came, they arrived into a life already mapped by necessity. Infancy was perilous. Many did not survive their first winters. But those who grew strong enough learned quickly what was expected of them. Boys practiced with wooden swords, not merely for sport, but in preparation for the day they might defend the village. Girls learned to spin wool and to soothe crying babies so their mothers could return to the fields. Disease was an ever-present threat. Fevers that spread from cottage to cottage, coughs that worsened in damp air, injuries that festered without treatment. The knowledge of herbs and poultices was prized, passed along through generations of women who knew how to coax healing from the land itself. But no charm or salve could turn aside every illness, and graves were dug in every season. And yet, in the face of all this, the common folk endured. They carried a pride that did not need titles or heraldry, a conviction that to survive was itself a triumph. They knew that the land did not truly belong to them, but they loved it all the same. The low fields brushed by wind, the black hills that turned purple in the heather's bloom, the burns that sang their own quiet hymns through every valley. If you picture a crofter returning home at dusk, boots heavy with mud, shoulders bent, eyes lifting to the faint stars, you might glimpse something unremarkable and miraculous all at once. A life sustained by the simple determination to begin again tomorrow. And you may find yourself wondering how many generations laid that same path, how many unseen lives built the world that would come after. The unending spirit of the Scottish people, even as centuries rolled on and the patterns of life shifted, there remained something in Scotland that no war, plague, or edict could wholly erase. It was a quiet force, less visible than the crowns or the clan banners, and more enduring than any castle of stone. It was the spirit of the people themselves, a resilience that passed from parent to child, taking root in the harsh soil and the hidden corners of the heart. When the great battles faded into memory, ordinary men and women still rose each morning to face the same unchanging challenges. The hunger that crept into every home in winter, the long distances between settlements, the knowledge that all they built could be undone by a single raid or a single season of rain. In some places, this daily struggle bred suspicion and bitterness. In others, it inspired a quiet solidarity. After Bannockburn and the hard-won recognition of a Scottish king, the country did not settle into lasting peace. New rivalries emerged to fill the space left by old ones. The Stuart dynasty rose, determined to bring a patchwork realm into the shape of a kingdom. But while kings issued proclamations, most Scots measured time by smaller, more dependable markers. The lambing in spring, the cutting of peat, the return of the herring shoals. In the Highlands, the old clan ties still shaped life. Even in times when the crown sought to diminish their power, chiefs held the loyalty of their people. It was loyalty built not only on lineage, but on necessity. A crofter might resent the laird's demands, but he also knew that the clan offered the only real protection against famine, feud, or invasion. No royal decree could break that unspoken contract. For Highlanders, identity was woven into every aspect of life. It was in the tartan that marked a man's kin, in the Gaelic songs that rose over the hills at night, in the stories that stretched back to days when the first ancestors had crossed the sea from Ireland. Even as English grew in the lowlands and in the court, the old language remained a private inheritance. Lowland Scots moved at a different pace. Towns grew larger and more prosperous. Trade with England and Europe brought new goods and ideas. Burgs developed their own rhythms, markets bustling beneath the watchful spire of the kirk, craftsmen forming guilds, magistrates writing down laws in careful script. In these streets, the rough edges of feudal life softened, replaced by something more ordered, but no less precarious. Yet all across Scotland, the core of existence remained stubbornly the same. The land itself dictated the terms of survival. Poor harvests could undo years of careful planning. Illness could sweep through a village, erasing lives with no regard for wealth or piety. And through each ordeal, Scots learned again and again that endurance was their most essential skill. It was not only hardship that shaped them. There were moments of grace, gatherings for festivals, when even the poorest families shared music and laughter. On Beltane and Lammas, bonfires were lit on hilltops, their glow visible for miles across the dark. These were times when the weight of duty lifted, and people remembered that life could also be a celebration. Religion continued to cast its long shadow. The Catholic Church remained a source of ritual and reassurance, but its power was already beginning to wane as the Reformation approached. In quiet corners, men and women began to question the wealth of the clergy, the relics and indulgences, the Latin prayers that felt so far removed from their daily sorrows. It would be many years before this quiet dissent erupted into open transformation. But already the first cracks were there. Still, amid change and uncertainty, there was a certain unyielding continuity. Children were born into lives much like their parents. Small houses warmed by peat fires, fields that demanded everything and returned just enough, a sky so wide it humbled even the proudest heart. The same lullabies were sung to them. The same blessings were murmured over their cradles. In time, many would leave their homeland behind. Waves of Scots would set sail across cold seas, seeking land and security in distant places. Some went unwillingly, victims of eviction or punishment. Others left in hope, carrying little more than faith that hard work could build a better life. Yet wherever they went, they carried something of Scotland within them, a memory of hills and heather, of stone cottages and clan ties, of stories that refuse to be forgotten. When you picture a twilight settling over the glens, the last glow of the sun catching on the distant peaks, you might sense that this is what endures, beyond all history. The quiet persistence of people who learned to survive in a land that asked everything of them. And as the night deepens and the winds move across the heather, you may find yourself wondering whether the spirit of those long-ago Scots still lingers there, something invisible, yet alive, whispering that no hardship can ever quite extinguish the will to endure. The arrival of the Black Death. In the year 1350, the ships crept into the harbors of Scotland under a mantle of quiet dread. Their sails drooped in the chill wind, canvas hanging like tired arms after too long at sea. No banners flew from the masts, and no cheerful cries rose from their decks. Instead, there was only the slow, deliberate movement of men carrying crates and sacks, unaware that they were bearing the seeds of an invisible cataclysm. The rats came ashore first, their small bodies slipping through the cracks of cargo holds and onto the cobbles of the quays. In their fur and fleas lay a sickness that no Scotsman could have named, a darkness that slipped past every watchman and customs clerk. Within days, the first feverish bodies began to collapse in the crowded lanes of the port towns, though no one suspected that this was merely the opening note in a long, dissonant dirge. As winter waned, the infection moved northward, clinging to wool traders and fishmongers, to traveling friars and the tinkers who mended pots from village to village. It settled in the crofts and cottages, in manors and monasteries, finding no distinction between lord and laborer. Word spread in low, frightened voices of a terrible malady, one that darkened the skin and swelled the flesh into grotesque shapes. In Aberdeen and Perth, the burial grounds filled so quickly that graves were dug in shallow pits along the roadside. Wooden carts groaned beneath the weight of the newly dead, their wheels sinking into soft ruts where snowmelt had turned the earth to clay. At night, a hush settled over the towns, as if every soul held its breath, waiting for the plague to pass them by. Then came the torches, flickering along the alleys as watchmen marked the doorways with crude crosses in chalk or white paint. A symbol of warning, a silent sentence. Those within could not leave. Food was left on the thresholds. The families peered through shutters, some still hoping that prayer or the charity of neighbors would save them. But few could pretend for long. In the countryside, small parishes faced the pestilence with a kind of hollow disbelief. The priest would stand in the nave, his voice echoing among the stone pillars as he called the faithful to confession and last rites. Before dawn, many had already succumbed, their bodies arranged in rows beneath the nave's high windows. The chill did not slow the plague, nor did the isolation of remote glens. The sickness slipped along the tracks of traveling merchants and mendicants until it became a tide no village could hold back. Meanwhile, rumors swirled in the taverns and kirkyards. Some claimed the plague had been sent by God as punishment for pride. Others whispered that foreigners had poisoned the wells. But even these suspicions could not explain the randomness of it, the way strong men perished overnight, while the frail sometimes survived. By midsummer, a third of Scotland's people had vanished. Where once there had been voices, crying children, the chants of monks, the chatter of women at the looms, there was now only a hush broken by the cawing of crows. The harvests rotted in the fields, stalks bent under their own weight, as if bowing to a grief too vast to name. The few who remained began to understand that nothing would return to the way it had been. The plague spared no kinship, no office or estate. In some places, entire lineages were extinguished, their crests and records left to molder in abandoned halls. And yet, beneath the sorrow, life persisted. The hearth fires still glowed at dusk. The cows needed milking. The hay needed stacking. A fragile routine took hold, even as the shadows lengthened. It is said that in those months, the Scottish spirit was tempered like iron, heated and hammered until it could not easily break again. But perhaps that is only what survivors told themselves in the quiet years after, when they tried to make sense of so much loss. Even now, if you wander the graveyards where old stones lean against each other, you may feel it. The memory of that hush, the breathless fear that settled on every doorstep. One wonders if those first sailors had known what slept in their cargo, whether they would still have lowered their gangplanks to the shore. The silent scars of a fractured society. When the last of the plague carts had creaked away, and the priests had uttered their final Latin benedictions over fields turned into burial grounds, Scotland found itself transformed in ways no one could have foretold. The old rhythms of life, seed time, harvest, feast days, no longer moved with the same sure cadence. The empty cottages stood as mute witnesses to what had been lost. Their thatched roofs sagged under the damp of late summer rains, the hearths cold and gray, as if the spirit of each family had slipped away with the smoke of the final fire. In the towns, rows of shuttered shops and silent workshops formed narrow canyons where only the wind passed. For those who survived, a strange paradox unfolded. There was grief, deep and marrow-chilling, but also unexpected opportunity. Landowners who had once lorded over scores of tenant farmers now found themselves begging for laborers. Wages rose as the desperate competed for the few hands left to till the fields or tend the flocks. The serf who once bent low before his master now looked him in the eye, aware, perhaps for the first time, of his own worth. Yet such changes were slow to take hold in the Highlands, where the clans clung fiercely to their old ways. There, the bond between chief and clansman ran deeper than any parchment charter. A man might lose his kin to the pestilence, but he still owed loyalty to the chief who kept order and dispensed justice. In the crofts tucked between rocky ridges and blackwater lochs, the authority of ancient custom remained unbroken. Still, even the clans could not escape the slow erosion of their power. With so many mouths gone, tribute dwindled. The cattle herds grew lean, and the stores of oat and barley shrank. Some chiefs borrowed heavily to maintain their standing, only to find themselves mired in debt that would haunt their descendants. In the lowlands, a different kind of transformation unfurled. Wealth began to shift, sometimes subtly, sometimes in great torrents. Merchants who survived the plague returned to find competitors dead, and inventories sold off for pennies. They rebuilt their fortunes on the ruins, acquiring lands and influence that once lay far beyond their reach. Meanwhile, the church tried to reassert its authority over a shaken flock. Bishops spoke of divine punishment and called for more rigorous piety. But the people had seen too much to be easily cowed. Many began to wonder whether holy men who had fled at the first sign of fever could truly intercede with the Almighty. Even the rituals of the faith felt different now, familiar words and gestures hollowed out by the memory of unshriven deaths. Still, the church remained the one constant. The cathedrals rose over the towns like immense stone guardians, their bells tolling in the dawn and at dusk. In the dim candlelight of their naves, survivors found some measure of solace, kneeling to murmur prayers for souls they would never see again. As the decades crept onward, new generations were born who had never known the crowded villages and bustling fairs of the time before. To them, the plague was a tale half remembered by grandparents, a dark season when the world seemed to teeter on the brink of ending. They could not feel the weight of that silence the way their elders did, though they carried its consequences in every field and hamlet. Some scholars later claimed that the plague hastened the decline of serfdom in Scotland. Others argued that it deepened the rift between highland and lowland ways of life. But in the moment, such theories did not matter. What mattered was survival, gathering the harvest, repairing the roofs, burying the dead, and finding the courage to begin again. Even now, if you walk the weathered tracks between the crofts, you might see the faint outlines of the old fields that once fed entire clans. You might notice how many of them were never tilled again. They remain as quiet scars across the land, their emptiness a testament to the losses no census could fully record. And you might wonder what it was like to wake each morning in that world, where life was both precious and precarious, where every breath felt like a borrowed thing, and every dawn a small defiance against the darkness that had come before. The tide of clan feuds. When the plague loosened its grip, the Highlands did not greet the return of peace with open arms. Instead, a deeper restlessness began to seep through the glens. Old grievances, which disease had momentarily eclipsed, came flooding back with a force as unstoppable as the spring melt. Clans measured their strength in kinship and cattle, and with so many families diminished, balance had shifted. Ancient pacts were broken or renegotiated in whispered councils around smoky hearths. Chiefs who once held sway over every loch and ridge now found their claims contested by rivals, emboldened by their weakness. The feud between the Campbells and the MacDonalds, already older than living memory, flared into new violence. The MacDonalds had suffered deeply under plague and famine, their herds thinned to shadows, and their warriors reduced to a handful of gaunt survivors. The Campbells, richer in land and men, saw an opportunity. Under the guise of settling a boundary dispute, they sent raiding parties into MacDonald territory, seizing cattle and burning storehouses. For the MacDonalds, the insult demanded vengeance. And so, a fresh cycle of reprisals began. Cattle were stolen back in midnight raids. Tacksmen, lesser chiefs sworn to their lords, gathered their men in narrow glens to plan ambushes and retake what had been lost. In this way, the feud became both an inheritance and a necessity, binding each generation to the last through shared grievance. It was not only the great clans who clashed. Smaller families, whose names never found their way into chronicles, also rose and fell in these endless contests. A quarrel over a patch of grazing land or the theft of a single cow could swell into decades of bloodshed. The feuds were not merely about wealth or pride. They were a way of preserving a fragile sense of identity in a world that seemed determined to erase it. To outsiders, merchants from Edinburgh, priests sent north to minister to scattered flocks, this ceaseless conflict appeared primitive, almost senseless. But to the clans, it was the only order they knew. Each raid and reprisal was woven into a long story that explained who they were and why they fought. The chiefs presided over this turbulence with a gravity that bordered on ritual. When disputes arose, they summoned their kinsmen to the hall. Long tables lit by tallow candles, the air thick with the smell of peat smoke and unwashed wool. Here, they would listen to grievances, weigh the honor of each claimant, and decide whether justice required compensation or the sword. Sometimes, the verdict was exile, a man stripped of protection and cast into the wilderness. Other times, it was vengeance carried out in the cold gray dawn, when neighbors awoke to find their barns aflame. In the lowlands, the feudal lords watched this turbulence with mingled fear and contempt. They believed themselves more civilized, more orderly. Yet even there, rivalries simmered beneath the surface, less visible perhaps, but no less bitter when they burst into the open. The Scottish kings tried, again and again, to impose the royal will on the Highlands. Statutes were proclaimed, oaths extracted under threat of forfeiture, castles seized and garrisoned by crown men. But as soon as the king's sheriffs turned their backs, the old ways resumed. The landscape itself seemed to conspire against authority. Narrow passes and hidden glens made pursuit slow and uncertain. A raiding party could vanish into the hills before the first warning reached the nearest tower. By the turn of the 15th century, some believed the clans would never be tamed. Chroniclers wrote of them as a separate race, untouchable and unknowable, their loyalty given only to their own blood. And yet even among these fierce people, moments of quiet endurance persisted. On winter nights, when the wind keened across the moors and the cattle pressed close to the byres for warmth, families gathered around the peat fire. Children drifted to sleep to the low drone of old stories, the same tales their ancestors had heard, of heroes who had defended the clan and vanished into legend. Outside, the cattle lay tethered in darkness, the clan's wealth and lifeblood, the cause of so many raids and retaliations. In the hush between gusts, a man might have wondered whether the struggle was worth the cost. But with dawn came the knowledge that survival was never given freely in the Highlands. It was claimed, one hard season after another, and so the feuds persisted, woven into the fabric of life, each fresh wound a reminder that in this harsh land, peace was the most fragile dream of all. The rituals of survival as the feuds raged on. Ordinary Highlanders continued the ancient rituals that tethered them to the land and to each other. Life was never still here. Even in the most peaceful seasons, the work was relentless. Every dawn, thin columns of smoke rose from low-roofed dwellings, signaling the start of another day of labor beneath the restless skies. In the short summers, when the heather bloomed purple and the wind smelled of warm grass, families drove their cattle to the higher pastures. The journey was called the transhumance, a migration repeated for centuries. Women and children led the shaggy beasts along narrow tracks, while men followed behind, scanning the ridgelines for raiders. Even a peaceful drive could turn violent if another clan claimed the grazing land as their own. Once in the uplands, families settled in simple sheilings, stone huts with turf roofs. The women churned butter, dried cheese on flat stones, and mended garments worn thin by work. At night, they lay huddled together for warmth, listening to the soft breathing of animals tethered close to the walls. Outside, the darkness pooled around the hills, deep and impenetrable. The cattle were their wealth and their future, and so they slept lightly, alert to any whistle or distant bark that might herald theft. Down in the glens, fields of oats and barley ripened in the hard-won earth. The men who tended them were gaunt from long winters of hunger. Years of poor harvests, raids, and plague had left entire families reduced to a few survivors. Yet the fields were sown each spring with the same hope, that this season might be kinder than the last. In this world, survival was an intricate choreography of custom, faith, and endurance. It was marked by small rites, the first furrow plowed under a cold April sky, the blessing murmured over seed grain, the lighting of a candle before the crude wooden cross in each home. These gestures offered a fragile reassurance that the world still contained a measure of order, even when so much was uncertain. The church, too, played its part. Parish priests moved between scattered settlements, carrying not only the rites of baptism and burial, but also the gossip that stitched together the isolated communities. They read proclamations from the king and condemned the perpetual feuding, though everyone knew such words would change nothing. When famine struck or the plague returned, villagers crowded into the kirk to pray for deliverance. Yet beyond the walls, the same winds blew and the same hunger waited. Weddings were among the few occasions for true celebration. A marriage bound two clans together, sometimes to end a feud, sometimes to seal an alliance against common enemies. These unions were more transaction than romance, but for a brief evening, the strain lifted. Torches lit the dark, and fiddlers played reels while men and women danced in the packed earth courtyards. They ate bannocks and broth, drank weak ale, and felt, for a moment, the illusion of abundance. But the festivities always ended too soon. With dawn came the knowledge that each bride and groom had joined a larger story, one defined by duty, by hardship, and by the perpetual defense of honor. For every marriage that softened old enmities, another grievance was kindled elsewhere, waiting to flare into violence. Beyond the settlements, the land itself remained a quiet witness. The mountains stood impassive above every quarrel. The burns and lochs reflected the same brooding sky that had seen countless generations toil and perish. The landscape absorbed every secret, every betrayal, every silent act of mercy, every small joy. As the seasons turned, the rituals of survival continued. Children were born and named, their futures already shaped by ancient obligations. The old died and were carried to the kirkyard, their passing noted in the fragile records of the parish register. The clan itself endured, held together by blood and memory. And always, in the hush of night, when the fires sank low and the cattle shifted in their pens, a deeper question lingered unspoken. whether this life, so hard and so unchanging, might one day yield to something gentler. But dawn always came, and with it the same labors, the same fears, the same quiet, necessary hope that the next day would bring no fresh calamity. The shadow of England, even as clans clashed among themselves, a larger power loomed just beyond the border. England, with its wealthier towns and stronger armies, regarded Scotland as a stubborn outpost that refused to be subdued. The shadow of conquest had hovered for generations, drifting in and out of focus as kings rose and fell. But whenever English ambition stirred, it cast a long darkness over the glens. The first great shock came in the closing years of the 13th century, when Edward Wolfert, called Longshanks for his towering height, marched north to enforce his claim of overlordship. His ambition was vast, and his patience limited. With methodical brutality, he set about breaking Scotland's independence. Longshanks' men sacked Berwick in 1296, killing thousands in a single day. Chroniclers wrote that the streets ran slick with blood, the cries of the dying echoing through the narrow lanes. The surviving townspeople were left to bury their dead and pay taxes to a king they had never called their own. Meanwhile, in Oise in the Highlands, the news traveled slowly, borne by traders and friars who arrived with grim tidings. Clan chiefs weighed their chances. Some saw advantage in siding with the English crown, while others resolved to resist no matter the cost. In this hard land, where loyalty to kin outweighed any allegiance to distant monarchs, such decisions fractured old alliances overnight. Among those who refused to yield was William Wallace, a minor noble whose name would outlive the ruin of many greater lords. In 1297, Wallace gathered a band of men who had lost homes and kin to the English occupation. They struck with sudden violence, ambushing patrols and burning supply convoys. To the common folk, Wallace's defiance became a flickering hope. To Edward, it was an intolerable rebellion. The two sides collided at Stirling Bridge in September of that year. The English army, confident in its power, advanced over the narrow crossing. When half their force had committed to the bridge, Wallace's spearmen surged from concealment. The English line crumpled, men and horses tumbling into the cold waters of the Forth. It was a stunning victory, one that briefly made Wallace guardian of Scotland. Yet even triumph could not banish the underlying fear that English vengeance would soon return. Indeed, the reprisal came swiftly. At Falkirk the following summer, Edward's longbowmen cut down the Scottish ranks in punishing volleys. Wallace's army dissolved, leaving the survivors to limp home through fields littered with the dead. The dream of independence flickered and dimmed, but never quite died. In the years that followed, the land knew no lasting peace. Edward's governors imposed harsh levies, extracting grain and cattle from communities already hollowed out by raids. Fortresses were garrisoned, roads patrolled, and new laws proclaimed in the king's name. But no edict could root out the old loyalties that smoldered in every glen and valley. In secret gatherings, men pledged themselves to the cause of freedom, whispering oaths by the light of tallow candles. Meanwhile, in the lowlands, towns that had once prospered under local rule became garrisons and tax stations. Markets withered, artisans fled, fields lay fallow for want of hands to work them. Even those who had welcomed the English found little comfort in their rule. The king's justice, it seemed, was as unyielding as the Scottish winter. When Wallace was captured in 1305, bound in chains and dragged to London, the English thought they had broken the last spirit of defiance. His execution, brutal even by the standards of the age, was meant to end the dream of a free Scotland. But instead, it transfigured him into legend. In every village, in every Highland croft, his story was retold in low voices beside the hearth. A man who had dared to fight for something larger than himself. After Wallace, Robert the Bruce took up the banner of resistance, and at Bannockburn in 1314, his army of spearmen stood fast against the English cavalry. For a day, hope was vindicated, and the English were driven south in confusion. Yet even then, no one believed the struggle was truly over. The border was long, the English ambition deeper than any single defeat could quench. So the shadow of England remained, a constant presence just over the horizon. It was a darkness that pressed down upon every life, shaping decisions made in quiet council chambers and in the wind-swept fields alike. For the clans, for the crofters and tenants and craftsmen, it was a reminder that no matter how fierce their quarrels with each other, there was always a greater force waiting to assert its claim. And in the hush before sleep, when the cattle were penned and the hearth embers glowed low, many must have wondered whether their children would inherit anything more than this endless cycle of struggle. But dawn always came, and with it, the same cold certainty. The fight for Scotland's soul was far from over. The silent scourge of the Black Death. When the pestilence arrived, it did not come with banners or battle cries. No war horse carried it across the border. No sword defended against it. Instead, it slipped ashore on merchant ships, invisible to the eye, but potent enough to unmake a kingdom. In 1349, the Black Death reached Scotland. By spring, it was everywhere. The first to fall were often those closest to the ports, the dockhands and fishmongers who loaded bales of wool and salted herring. They sickened with a sudden fever. Their armpits and groins swelled with dark buboes, tender as bruised fruit. Then came the retching of blackened blood, the delirium, and the silence that followed. Families barred their doors in fear, but the sickness found them all the same. Word spread across the glens, carried on the breath of traveling friars and traders who spoke of towns where entire streets lay still. In Perth, the dead were stacked like cordwood outside the kirk. In Edinburgh, priests struggled to keep pace with the funerals, their voices hoarse with unending prayers for the departed. Some said the pestilence was God's judgment, a punishment for hidden sins. Others believed it was a miasma, a poisonous vapor rising from the earth itself. But explanations did nothing to dull the terror. By midsummer, whole villages had vanished. Cattle wandered untended, the fields filled with thistles and weeds. Even the fiercest clans laid down their quarrels for a time, knowing no raid or feud mattered when death crept through every doorway. To survive was to witness the collapse of everything familiar. In the Highlands, where isolation had once protected communities from war, the plague brought no safety. Small settlements on the slopes of Ben Nevis lost nearly every soul. In the lowlands, the markets fell silent, trade ceasing as carts stood abandoned with their loads of sheepskins and barley. Monks recorded the toll in spidery script, page after page of names, many left unfinished when the scribes themselves succumbed. The clergy bore the burden heavily. Priests tended to the sick until they too were struck down. Some churches closed their doors, unable to provide last rites or even simple burial. The rituals that had once offered solace now seemed hollow in the face of such indiscriminate ruin. In desperation, people clung to any sign of divine mercy, a relic passed hand to hand, a pilgrimage to a holy well. But more often, they simply waited, listening to the shallow breaths of the afflicted, and hoping the wind would shift and carry the pestilence elsewhere. Yet there were strange mercies in the aftermath. With so many laborers dead, the survivors found themselves with unexpected leverage. Tenants demanded better terms from landlords, eager to keep their lands productive. Debtors escaped obligations when creditors perished. Wages rose. Some families, having buried all but one child, saw that child inherit fields and livestock beyond what any peasant could have dreamed. But the wealth did little to ease the ache of memory. In every settlement, there were empty cottages no one dared claim. Overgrown grave mounds dotted the parish greens, sometimes marked only by crude wooden crosses. The children who survived grew into adults haunted by half-remembered images, faces gone slack in death, the hush that fell over a house when the last voice faded. And in art and song, a new motif took shape. The dance of death. Painters showed skeletons leading kings and paupers alike to the same end. Minstrels sang verses that reminded listeners of life's fragility, the way fortune could shift without warning. Gradually, the plague receded, though it never fully disappeared. Smaller outbreaks returned every generation, like a bitter echo of the first devastation. Some historians would later say that the Black Death loosened old bonds, weakening the feudal ties that had held Scottish society together. Perhaps it did, but in those years, it felt less like liberation and more like a long, cold reckoning. Even as the fields bloomed again and trade resumed, no one truly believed the world was unchanged. The pestilence had stripped away illusions of safety and permanence. It left a quiet understanding that life was never more than a flickering candle in the wind. And when night came and the hearth embers glowed low, those who had endured still felt the hollow spaces where voices had once been. They must have wondered what hidden trials lay ahead, waiting beyond the reach of any prayer or plea to the clan wars and the endless feuds. In the centuries that followed the first waves of plague, the clans of the Highlands and Western Isles returned to the rhythms that had shaped their world for generations, raiding, feuding, and defending the honor of their kin. The plague had left fields abandoned and villages weakened, but it did not still the restless hearts of the chieftains. Every valley had its own story of betrayal or vengeance. Some were no more than whispered rumors, while others grew into sagas recited by the hearth long after the warriors who inspired them were dust. Clan Campbell and Clan MacDonald stood out among these tales, locked in a rivalry that was as much about pride as it was about land. It began in earnest when Robert the Bruce granted the Campbells new territories as a reward for loyalty during the Wars of Independence. The MacDonalds, who had long claimed the same lands, took the gift as an unforgivable slight. Neither side forgot, and neither forgave. When spring came and the passes cleared of snow, raiding parties slipped into the glens by moonlight. They drove off cattle, set fire to storehouses, and struck down any who dared resist. A single raid might ignite years of retribution. Children grew up under the shadow of these feuds, taught to memorize every injury their fathers had suffered. Elsewhere, the MacLeods fought the MacNeils, the Grants quarreled with the Gordons, and countless smaller kindreds traded insults and blows over boundaries drawn with no more precision than a shepherd's cairn. The clan system offered identity and protection, but it also demanded a readiness to take up arms on short notice. In the Highlands, the chief was more than a landlord. He was a father figure and judge, the one who decided when a grievance must be settled by blood. His hall might be little more than a stout tower house with peat smoke curling from the roof, but within its walls, decisions were made that could upend hundreds of lives. To live in such a world was to know that peace was always provisional. A shepherd tending his flock might look up to see strangers on the ridge, their cloaks billowing in the wind, their weapons catching the pale northern light. In that moment, he would not wonder who they were. He would only ask which grievance they carried in their hearts. Clan feuds had their own strange order, a code that was both harsh and predictable. If a man was killed, compensation, blood money, might be offered to prevent the feud from widening. But if the death was deemed treacherous, or if the insult too grave, no payment sufficed. Revenge became a duty. In the courts of Edinburgh, kings and lords wrung their hands at this endless cycle. They issued proclamations forbidding raids and demanding loyalty to the crown. But their writs held little power in the steep glens and heathered slopes, where a chief's word mattered more than any royal decree. During the reign of James IV, the crown made one of its most determined efforts to pacify the Highlands. The king himself sailed to the Isles, taking hostages and extracting oaths. He ordered forts raised and sheriffs appointed. But as soon as his fleet vanished over the horizon, the clans returned to their old ways. The feud reached a particularly bitter crescendo in the 17th century. In the winter of 1692, government troops led by the Campbells arrived in Glencoe under the pretext of seeking hospitality from the MacDonalds. For 12 days they shared fires and bread, the MacDonalds believing the strangers were friends. On the final morning, the Campbells rose before dawn and slaughtered their hosts as they slept. The massacre of Glencoe became an indelible wound in Scottish memory. It was proof, if any were needed, that no promise could be trusted in a land where loyalty to the clan weighed all other bonds. Yet even in these violent times, there were moments of fragile peace. Seasonal fairs and markets offered a place where rival clans could mingle without bloodshed, trading cattle, cloth, and iron tools. Marriages were arranged to bind old enemies together, though such unions rarely erased the bitterness that lay beneath. This was the paradox of the Highlands, a society bound by fierce kinship, and yet forever fracturing under the weight of pride and revenge. A place where children learned to wield a dirk as soon as they could walk, and where every man knew that one day he might die defending a grievance older than himself. As the centuries turned, the clans would face pressures no feud could withstand. New laws, new armies, and the slow erosion of the old ways. But in this era, when the glens still belonged to the chiefs and the shouts of raiders echoed across the heather, the clans remained the beating heart of Scotland's wild and weary soul. And as the mists rolled in each evening, it was easy to imagine that these struggles would go on forever, as timeless and unyielding as the mountains themselves. The church and the shadow of faith, the clans were not the only power shaping medieval Scotland. Alongside the chiefs and their restless warriors stood the Catholic Church, a force as pervasive as it was unassailable. From the lowliest croft to the king's great hall, the church's presence was woven into every ritual, every fear, and every fleeting hope that flickered in a hard and transient life. Even in the most remote glens, stone kirks rose above clusters of barf-roofed cottages, their bells tolling reminders of sin and salvation. For many Scots, the church was the single constant in a world of shifting alliances and sudden violence. It was the keeper of rights no clan chief could grant: baptism, marriage, absolution, and burial. But while faith offered comfort, it also demanded surrender. Each year, a tenth of every harvest was tithed to the church. No matter how lean the season, or how many mouths begged for scraps of oat bannock, the tithe was paid. Priests and abbots moved through the land in fine robes, their hands outstretched for offerings, their words laced with warnings of damnation for those who failed in their duty. Monasteries like Melrose and Dunfermline stood as islands of learning and charity. Within their thick walls, monks preserved sacred texts and offered refuge to travelers and the destitute. Yet even these sanctuaries were not immune to corruption. Abbots grew wealthy on rents extracted from tenant farmers, and the church's appetite for land was as relentless as any feuding clans. In times of plague, the church became the only recourse for those who could not understand the invisible hand of sickness. When the Black Death swept across Scotland in the 14th century, priests carried the last rites into cottages marked with white crosses. They walked among the dying with only incense and whispered prayers for protection. Many clergy perished alongside their flock, their loss leaving parishes abandoned and faith tested to its limits. The medieval mind saw pestilence as punishment. Chroniclers wrote of God's wrath poured out upon a sinful people. Some took this message to heart with a fervor that bordered on desperation. Penitents gathered in fields, stripping to the waist to flog their own backs until the earth ran dark with blood. They believed their suffering might avert the plague's hunger. When the sickness subsided, it left behind a landscape littered with mass graves and a deepening suspicion of the church's authority. If all the prayers, relics, and rituals could not stop the dying, what did it mean for a people who had entrusted every hope of salvation to the clergy's hands? Even so, the rhythms of devotion resumed. Bells summoned the faithful to Mass. Processions wound through village lanes on saints' days, banners fluttering, candles flickering in the wind. In the Highlands, old beliefs lingered at the edges of official faith, fragments of pagan custom that no bishop could entirely uproot. Charms were whispered over newborns, and sacred wells were visited in secret. The church tolerated some of these practices, absorbing them as best it could into the fabric of orthodoxy. But when suspicion of witchcraft took hold in the 16th century, that tolerance vanished. Ministers and magistrates launched witch hunts with grim resolve. Women who brewed herbal remedies or midwives who knew too much of birth and death were hauled before tribunals. Torture became an acceptable path to confession. Thumbs crushed in iron screws, legs clamped in boots filled with boiling oil. A whispered accusation could end in a pyre. Neighbors watched as women were bound to stakes, the flames leaping higher until only charred bone remained. All of it done in the name of cleansing sin and protecting the community from invisible evils. Yet even at its most brutal, the church remained the guardian of memory and learning. Monks copied chronicles that preserved the names of kings and the lineage of clans. Nuns tended the sick, fed the orphaned, and offered solace to the grieving. In a land that could seem endlessly cruel, their quiet works of mercy were small lamps against the darkness. It is easy now to see only the oppression, the tithes, the fear, the burnings. But for the people of medieval Scotland, the church was also the single bridge between this life and what lay beyond. At the hour of death, when the hearth had grown cold and the cattle stood lowing outside, it was the priest's voice that promised a reunion in a gentler place, where hunger and feud no longer mattered. And so they clung to faith as they clung to kin, aware that both could wound as easily as they could comfort. In the end, the church's power was not only in its wealth or its rituals, but in the quiet way it shaped the hearts of a people accustomed to hardship, teaching them to look beyond the next harvest, the next raid, the next winter, to something more lasting, even if it could never be seen. And in the hush of twilight, as the last notes of a vesper hymn faded across the fields, a weary soul might feel for a moment that all the suffering had purpose, that somewhere, beyond the dark horizon, there waited a peace too vast for any man to fathom. The Black Death's shadow. The 14th century was already an age of struggle and sorrow for the Scots, but it was in the year 1349 that a darkness fell upon the land, unlike any before. It came quietly at first, in the holds of merchant ships drifting into Leith and Aberdeen, their crews sick with a strange fever. No one then knew of fleas or bacilli, or how the plague had stolen aboard. They only knew that within days, whole households began to perish. The sickness did not discriminate. It took the strong before the weak, children before elders, priests before common laborers. One morning, a crofter might rise to tend his oats, only to find by sundown that every member of his household lay groaning and delirious on the floor. The symptoms were unmistakable: dark swellings in the groin or under the arms, fevers that left the mind wandering in strange, half-lucid dreams, and bleeding that would not stop. Villages emptied almost overnight. In the lowlands, the roads filled with mourners, carrying the bodies of their kin to hurried graves, the smell of lime mingling with the summer air. In the highlands, isolated communities held out longer, but even there, no glen was spared forever. Gaelic poets composed verses that spoke of a world unraveling, of a punishment no piety could forestall. The church tried to maintain order, but priests were among the earliest to succumb. Without them, baptisms and last rites went unperformed. Bells that once tolled for celebration now rang in dirges day after day, until the living could no longer summon the strength to toll them at all. Authorities in the burgs did what they could to slow the contagion. Houses where illness appeared were sealed shut, white crosses painted over doorposts. Inside, the sick were left to die, their cries muffled by timbers nailed fast. No one dared enter to bring water or comfort. In the ports, guards turned away any ship suspected of carrying the pestilence, though by then, it was too late. Those who survived the first wave emerged to a land half deserted. Fields lay untended, cattle wandered through abandoned lanes, and parish records simply ended in blank pages, entire lineages lost. The great abbeys struggled to keep their ranks filled, as monks fell faster than novices could be trained. In the void of so much sudden death, the social order began to shift in ways no lord or bishop could fully control. For the peasantry, there came a grim paradox. With so many laborers dead, wages rose, and the bonds of serfdom loosened. A tenant who had once bowed low before his laird might now demand better terms or leave altogether for a more favorable holding. Land that had belonged to one family for generations changed hands in a season. Entire estates passed into new ownership simply because no heirs remained to claim them. Among the survivors, a deep suspicion took root that no incense or relics could protect them. Some turned to fierce penance, believing the plague to be divine retribution for their sins. They joined processions bearing crosses and relics, praying aloud for deliverance as they trudged from village to village. Others, hollowed by loss, abandoned faith altogether, unable to reconcile the image of a merciful God with the sight of mass graves piled high with the innocent. Yet even this devastation was not the end. The plague returned again and again, in lesser waves through the century, each time renewing the sense that life itself was frail and borrowed. Chroniclers noted how the fear of sudden death gave rise to a somber piety. Testaments and wills were drawn up with meticulous care. Wealthy families bequeathed money to have masses said in perpetuity for their souls. Artists began to carve and paint the dance of death, grim figures leading men and women of all stations in one final procession. And in the hush that followed each wave, when the bells fell silent and the air grew still again, Scotland began to reckon with all that had been taken. The survivors carried scars beyond the body, an unspoken understanding that no fortress, no kin bond, no fervent prayer was a shield against the randomness of fate. In the glens and the burgs alike, that knowledge softened some hearts and hardened others. Still, life pressed on. The seasons did not wait for grief to ease. Fields were reseeded, herds replenished, hearths rebuilt. Children were born into a quieter land, where their elders spoke in hushed tones of the plague years, and the memory of what they had endured became as much a part of the landscape as the standing stones and wind-swept hills. If you had wandered through a village in those years after the pestilence, you might have seen new markers in the kirkyard, simple crosses without names, erected in haste. You might have heard the old folk murmuring that no generation would ever again forget how swiftly everything could vanish. And you might have felt, in the cold hush before dawn, that the shadow of the Black Death still lingered, a lesson etched in every heart about the fragility of flesh and the stubbornness of hope. And somewhere beyond the mountains, the next chapter of Scotland's story waited, as inexorable as the tide, the clans in their prime. In the wake of pestilence and war, as the 15th century unfolded, the Highlands remained a realm apart, a place where clan life reached its fullest expression, with all the quiet certainties and sudden violences that came with it. Across the glens, the clans grew into formidable networks of kinship and obligation, woven more tightly than any feudal bond could ever be. To be born into a clan was to inherit a story larger than yourself, passed down in the measured cadences of Gaelic song and the proud recitals of genealogy. In these tales, ancestors rose from obscurity to carve out territories in the wilderness, fighting rival chiefs for the right to claim the heathered hills as their own. Each clan preserved its memory in a banner, a badge, a line of descent that could be traced back, sometimes truthfully, sometimes by wishful invention, to mythic founders. A Highland chief was not simply a landlord or a noble. He was the keystone of the clan's existence. In his hall, he presided over councils where alliances were sworn, disputes weighed, and punishments decreed. He was father and judge, protector and avenger, bound by honor to defend his people against all comers. In return, every clansman owed him service, tribute in cattle and grain, loyalty in word and deed, and the promise to rally at a moment's notice when the fiery cross was sent from glen to glen. This symbol, a charred and bloodied cross, was the summons to arms. When it appeared, no man dared ignore it. Neighbors who might have shared bread one week could be enemies the next, as feuds simmered and boiled over without warning. To outsiders, this constant readiness for violence seemed barbarous, but to the clans, it was simply the necessary posture of a people whose land was never fully secure. Each autumn, as the harvest ended and nights grew long, the cattle raids began. Long columns of men would slip through mountain passes under the cover of darkness, driving off lowing herds as payment for an old insult or a newly imagined slight. The raiders moved quickly, taking only what their ponies could carry, vanishing into the mists before any counterattack could catch them. In the morning, the robbed clan would send up the hue and cry, and the cycle of vengeance turned once more. The chiefs were not merely warlords. They were the guardians of a culture that prized song, memory, and ceremony as much as the sword. Poets and bards held places of honor in their halls, reciting lineage and valor in verses that could take hours to unfold. A well-composed lament for a fallen warrior was as prized as a fine blade. Even amid the hardships, the clans carried their traditions forward, a tapestry of music, dance, and ritual that stitched meaning into lives often cut short by violence or disease. In this time, the great houses of the Isles rose to their zenith. The MacDonalds, styling themselves Lords of the Isles, ruled much of the western seaboard. Like kings in all but name, their galleys plied the stormy seas, carrying warriors and tribute between the Isles and the mainland. When the Stuart kings looked north, they saw a domain they could neither easily conquer nor entirely ignore. More than once, a monarch ventured into the Highlands, seeking to bind the chiefs by treaty or threat. And more than once, They returned to Edinburgh with little to show but uneasy pledges soon broken. While the Highlands remained resolutely Gaelic, the Lowlands were shifting toward a different way of life. There, the burghs grew richer on trade with England and the continent. Merchants built tall houses of stone. Guilds of craftsmen regulated the making of cloth, leather, and iron. The English language slowly crept north, mingling with Scots and displacing Gaelic in market squares and parish records. But in the glens and islands, the old tongue remained, as inseparable from the people as the land itself. It was in this contrast, between a rising lowland world of market law and a Highland society of kin and custom, that many later conflicts found their roots. The kings who wished to centralize power saw the clans as obstacles, stubbornly clinging to their own codes. The chiefs, for their part, viewed the royal courts with suspicion, knowing too well how easily a distant monarch might bestow their ancestral lands on some southern favorite. Yet for all the tension, there was also a slow mingling. Highland cattle made their way to lowland fairs. Mercenaries from the glens served in royal armies. Marriages linked noble houses across the cultural divide. In quiet seasons, the boundaries blurred, and a kind of wary coexistence prevailed. But always, the clan remained the first allegiance. No oath to king or church outweighed the bond of blood. A man's worth was measured by his loyalty to his kin, his courage when the cross was raised, and his readiness to shed blood for the honor of his ancestors. In this way, the clans thrived, rooted in old customs, strengthened by hardship, and carried forward by the unbreakable conviction that their way of life was as ancient and enduring as the mountains themselves. And somewhere in that unyielding loyalty, there lay the seeds of both the clan's greatest triumphs and their eventual undoing, a truth that time would reveal in its own slow, inexorable fashion: the decline of the clan system. As the 16th century drew to a close, the winds began to shift in ways the clans could not hold back. What had once seemed timeless, loyalty to the kin group above all else, was slowly being undermined by forces larger than any feud or cattle raid. The rise of centralized authority, the spread of new religious fervor, and the tightening grasp of lowland law all conspired to erode the independence the chiefs had guarded for generations. It began, quietly enough, with letters and proclamations. The Stuart kings, determined to tame the North, sent royal sheriffs and tax collectors into the glens. They came bearing seals and statutes rather than swords, though the threat of force always hung behind their words. Chiefs were summoned to Edinburgh to pledge their loyalty in person, a ritual designed to humble them before the crown. Many complied, if only in appearance, returning home to do as they pleased until the next summons arrived. But some clans found themselves drawn deeper into the monarch's orbit. To gain favor or avoid punishment, chiefs offered tribute in the form of men and arms. A few even allowed lowland officials to administer their lands, setting in motion the slow replacement of ancient Gaelic customs with the king's law. These concessions often bred resentment among clansmen, who felt their leaders were selling out their inheritance for royal approbation. Meanwhile, religion was sowing further division. The Reformation swept across Scotland in a tide of Protestant zeal, overturning centuries of Catholic ritual. In the Lowlands, burgh councils and lairds embraced the new faith, dismantling abbeys and claiming church lands as their own. In the Highlands, however, many clans clung to the old ways, their Catholicism intertwined with ancestral identity. The rift hardened suspicion on both sides. Southerners saw Highlanders as backward and superstitious, while Highlanders viewed the Reformed Kirk as a lowland imposition. The friction found a new expression in legal reforms, meant to break the power of the chiefs. The Statutes of Iona, issued in 1609, forced clan leaders to send their sons to lowland schools, where they were taught English manners and Protestant doctrine. Chiefs were required to house government officials, keep peace within their territories, and cease the practice of harboring fugitives. It was, in effect, an attempt to domesticate the Gaelic nobility, to pull them into a system that would make them servants of the crown rather than sovereigns in their own lands. At first, the impact was uneven. Some chiefs ignored the laws entirely. Others complied only enough to avoid forfeiture of their estates. But the seeds were planted. Over time, each new regulation chipped away at the clan's autonomy. As generations of children were educated in lowland schools, the old traditions began to slip from memory. The pressure did not come only from Edinburgh. Economic change was beginning to gnaw at the edges of clan society. The cattle trade, once the backbone of the Highland economy, was increasingly dominated by merchants from the south who demanded regular supply and stable prices. Chiefs found themselves indebted to lowland creditors, forced to levy new rents on their tenants. The bonds of mutual obligation that had bound clans together were strained as chiefs behaved more like landlords than patriarchs. And so, beneath the surface, the ties that held the clans together began to fray. Young men who once found purpose in raiding now drifted to lowland towns to hire themselves out as laborers or soldiers. The Gaelic tongue, so long the vessel of shared memory, yielded ground to Scots and English. Even in the heartlands of clan culture, change crept in like a cold draft through a cracked door. Yet for all these encroachments, the Highlands remained stubbornly apart. The old loyalties persisted in hidden glens and isolated islands. Chiefs still convened councils in smoky halls, still dispensed justice according to ancient precedent. When rival clans clashed, the law of the crown might as well have been written in some distant, unapproachable land. It was this paradox, partial surrender to royal authority, but fierce retention of custom, that would, in time, prove unsustainable. For a while, the delicate balance held, but no edict or statute could fully reconcile the Highland way of life with a kingdom increasingly governed by centralized power, Protestant discipline, and market economy. And so the clans carried on in their rugged fastness, outwardly unchanged, but inwardly aware that the world beyond the mountains was gathering its strength and its resolve. One day, those forces would arrive in full, determined to make the Highlands submit to a vision of Scotland that no longer had room for the old clan order. It was a reckoning yet to come, and in those final years of uneasy autonomy, few could have foreseen how total the transformation would be. But the first cracks had appeared, and the long decline had already begun, quietly, inevitably, like the first drift of snow before a deep winter sets in. The final reckoning. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Highlands had become a land out of step with the wider world. While Edinburgh and Glasgow bustled with trade, learning, and polite society, the glens remained steeped in the rhythms of feuding kin and ancient loyalties. It was an enduring culture, but also an increasingly vulnerable one, like an old fortress whose walls, once unassailable, had begun to crumble under the strain of time. For the chiefs, the centuries-old balance of power was dissolving faster than they could grasp. The Union of 1707, which joined Scotland and England under a single parliament, set in motion a new wave of legislation and economic integration. The lowland nobility prospered, finding fresh wealth and opportunity in the expanding British Empire. But in the Highlands, the same changes felt like an encroachment, a final confirmation that the old ways were no longer secure. Amid this tension, the Jacobite cause began to take hold. More than a dynastic struggle, It was a cry of defiance from those who felt dispossessed by modernity itself. Many Highland clans threw in their lot with the exiled Stuarts, believing that a return of their line might restore the ancient order of fealty, faith, and clan autonomy. It was a gamble made as much from desperation as conviction. In 1715, the first Jacobite rising erupted, as Highland chiefs mustered their men under the banner of James Francis Edward Stuart. For a time, it seemed as if the clans might overwhelm the government garrisons. But the momentum faltered. The poorly supplied army dissolved back into the hills after inconclusive battles, leaving the chiefs to face fines, forfeitures, and a deepening mistrust from the crown. 3 decades later, the stakes would rise again. In 1745, Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, landed on the west coast and called the clans to his standard. A fresh wave of fervor swept the Highlands. From Skye to Lochaber, tacksmen rallied their tenants, promising the return of Stuart kings and the end of lowland oppression. For a few glorious months, the rising seemed destined for triumph. The Jacobite army marched as far south as Derby, stirring fear in the hearts of English ministers. But hope unraveled as swiftly as it had been kindled. Lacking supplies and foreign support, the Highlanders turned north again. The final confrontation came on a wind-swept moor near Inverness, Culloden. On that April morning in 1746, the last great army of the clans formed their ranks in the drizzle, pikes and broadswords clutched in calloused hands. Across the field, government troops waited in disciplined lines, muskets loaded and artillery trained. When the order came, the Highlanders surged forward in a furious charge. It was an old way of fighting, close quarters and full of raw courage. But against well-drilled infantry and cannon, it ended in slaughter. In less than an hour, the Jacobite dream was shattered. Thousands lay dead or dying, the heather stained dark beneath them. Those who fled into the hills faced months of brutal pursuit and reprisal. The defeat at Culloden was not merely a battlefield loss. It marked the end of the clan system as it had existed for centuries. In the months that followed, government forces enacted a systematic dismantling of Highland culture. Chiefs were imprisoned or exiled. Their lands seized and redistributed to lowland proprietors. The carrying of arms was forbidden, along with the wearing of tartan and the playing of bagpipes, symbols of a defiant identity that the authorities were determined to erase. The statutes of proscription, imposed in 1746, struck at the heart of everyday life. Clan allegiance was criminalized. The tacksmen who had once bound communities together as middle-ranking leaders were driven out. Gaelic culture, already under pressure, began to retreat into the remote corners of the Highlands, a language and memory preserved in songs and stories, whispered by the hearth. Even the ancient bonds of kinship were broken by the new economic order. Chiefs who retained their estates often abandoned the traditional obligation to protect their people, embracing commercial sheep farming instead. The clearances that followed in the late 18th and early 19th centuries expelled thousands from the glens their ancestors had called home. Whole villages were emptied, their tenants forced to seek a livelihood in lowland cities or across the sea. Many departed with only a bundle of possessions and a last glance at the hills fading behind them. And so the culture that had withstood generations of war, famine, and plague finally gave way to the pressures of modern statehood and commerce. Yet if the visible trappings of the clans disappeared, the spirit of resilience remained. In Gaelic ballads and family memories, in place names and ancestral pride, the memory of that lost world endured. Today, the Highlands seem peaceful, silent glens, scattered crofts, and the ruins of old castles softened by moss and time. But beneath the quiet lies an echo of those turbulent centuries when life was defined by loyalty, hardship, and the unbreakable will to endure. If you walk those hills at dusk, you might feel it, the lingering presence of a people who would not be conquered easily, who carried their identity like a hidden ember in the dark. And so, as the last embers of the clan system faded into history, the story of the medieval Highlands drew to a close. Yet something essential survived, an unspoken testament that even when all seems lost, a culture can leave traces that never quite disappear. Somewhere in those wild landscapes, the old voices still murmur, and the spirit of the clans waits, patient as the hills themselves.